Hello, so my name is Adrienne Wallace. I'm a member of the People for Profit and the Socialist Worker Network here in Ireland. So I've just been asked to say a few words about the Repeal Campaign, and it was a fantastic campaign, so I'm always very happy to be able to talk about it. So I'll just go into a little bit of the history of it, and I suppose the history of Ireland and the treatment of women, and then just talk about the campaign itself and the success, amazing success. So just to say, so actually how it happened, how our laws became so strict, like up until we repealed the 8, you couldn't have an abortion even if your life was at risk. It was a 14-year jail sentence. There was just so many levels to it that was just so obscure and brutal, and it came in 1983 as a result actually of the liberalisation of the abortion laws in Britain. We just had some fundamentalists here who started to worry that women might have bodily autonomy and control over their own lives, and so took it upon themselves to actually enshrine it into the constitution of this country, leaving Ireland one of the very few places in the world where it was actually enshrined in the constitution, and that's why we needed the massive referendum to repeal it. And this came in two parts. Like, first and foremost, we have a sort of right-wing government that are very much like the Tories in terms of your policies and neoliberal and austerity, but they do dress themselves up a little bit better. They've created a sort of skin deep liberalism, but anyway, more on that later. But ultimately, what we had to do was not only fight this government for a referendum on it, and that took a lot of campaigning and a lot of hard work. We also then had to try and knock on the doors and talk to people and canvass people, and actually what we realised, because the vote was 66.3%, so a huge turnout for yes, and that we kind of realised that once you can push back the institutes that have controlled the people in Ireland for a long time, that's the state and that's the church massively. The two of them have gone hand in hand in creating conservative prisons for the people here, and once we were able to push them back, we've seen that the Irish people are actually quite progressive. I'd argue because we're very working class. No, but in terms of there is that element of sort of, I think actually it's a result of years of oppression that you just get a stronger sense of the right things in life, community and supporting women. And we saw that people didn't do it on a care or a compassion basis. They did it because of choice. They recognised that a woman should have a right to bodily autonomy. Now, so anyway, I've gone off track. But just to say, okay, so the X case, a brief history of what happened in Ireland and how we finally got here. So in 1992, there was a 14-year-old girl raped by a family friend. And she went to the UK for a abortion, and her family phoned the police at the time to say this, to let them know what was going on, because there was a court case ongoing. The Gardaí got onto the prosecution's court, and they actually made that young girl come back and refuse to allow her to leave the country to have an abortion. So this was a massive shock, I think, to an awful lot of people. And like young schoolgirls, I wasn't born, I was 2 at the time, but schoolgirls were out protesting. There was huge amounts of anger about it. And as a result, then I had to go through a very long court case where the girl herself was shock horror put on trial, essentially. And there is a transcript from the court case, and she does say, she goes that she wanted to end her life to solve things. And I think that's important, that we recognise of how women can sometimes internalise the stuff that we think we're to blame, when ultimately we're just trying to live our lives and have respect, or be able to have bodily control over our own bodies, and we expect the state and the institutes to have respect for it, but it doesn't, and that we internalise that. And that's something that we broke through with Repeal the 8, that we actually broke that stigma, and we broke a conservative legislative hold on us. So this had happened anyway. So eventually there was a referendum, and it was agreed that we're not going to stop women from travelling for an abortion, but we're still not allowed to have them here in this country. So that was 92. So then there's a second case, Miss Y. Now this is in 2014. Like, this is shocking stuff. Miss Y is an asylum seeker. So she arrived here, and soon after she found out that she was pregnant. This came as a result of a rape in her home country, and the HSE, which is like the NHS for yourselves, or Health Service Executive, she was in their care at that moment in time, and they actually stopped her from having an abortion. She was like 8 weeks gone. So it was very early on. She went on hunger strike, and they literally tied her to a bed and force fed her with injections. They didn't tell her anything that was going on. They were giving injections into the fetus to get it to sort of develop its lungs a bit faster, and then essentially what they did is they forced a C-section. So they tied a woman down and physically ripped her body open against her entire will the whole time. 2014 this was. So there was absolutely uproar. This is just a stain on Irish society, what they were doing to us. Then in 2012, we had Savita Halapanarva actually died as a result of being denied an abortion. She was miscarrying on a very much wanted pregnancy, and the family, her husband and so on, later put on a lawsuit against the HSC, and they just lost, and they had to apologise. And it came out that during this whole when all of this was happening, her husband was told that Ireland is a Catholic country, and that's why Savita wasn't getting an abortion here. And what happened to Miss Y with the asylum seeker, that shouldn't have happened, even because after Savita died in 2012, they brought in a Protection of Life During Pregnancy Act, which said if a woman is under serious risk to life, that she is entitled to an abortion. But it wasn't happening, is essentially what we're saying. So the legislation was not good enough. So we can see religion had a massive hand to play in all of this. Now that was a deliberate ploy, I think, after the sort of 1916 sort of nationalist movement that was happening. Kind of underneath all of that, there was a real sort of socialist movement happening. There was workers in Limerick had taken over factories with "we make bread, not profits." There was a real sort of resurgence of sort of working class consciousness and challenging not just British imperialism but capitalism essentially. And so to roll down on that, the conservative forces came in, and in our country this was De Valera, and he was a member of the Fianna Fáil party. And in school you're taught that De Valera is like the best thing since sliced bread, and then you see what he's done to the country. So even in the nationalist revolutionary movement, and even with the socialist movement at the time, women played a very large role in all this. But the minute De Valera actually got into power, all the women were literally pushed out of the history books, out of the Dáil, which is like our parliament, and De Valera opened the doors for the Catholic Church. Our constitution, it still is so antiquated. It says stuff like, a woman's place is in the home. It says we have to play a special role to the Catholic Church, and all these very obscure stuff. But not only did they do this in writing, they did it in material means too. So the Catholic Church were given access to, and I can see my timer going on 7 minutes. So this is just a bit of the history, and I'll talk about the campaign and I'll wrap up then. But what happened is that we had your social welfare and stuff like that was never seen as a right in this country an awful lot of the time. So if you needed support and assistance, you had to kind of go to the Catholic Church, and as a result, welfare and social support was not seen as a right, but it was seen something that you had to kind of go cap in hand and beg for, and this led to a massive amount of atrocities across the country. One of the most striking was that there was mother and baby homes all over. So any woman who fell outside of the typical norm of how you got pregnant, if it was out of wedlock, for example, if it was a result of rape, often a lot of women were just pushed into these centres where they had to work. It was essentially slave labour, and particularly for working class women. So it was an absolute atrocities what happened. And in Tuam, which is a place in Galway, there was a church there, and a mother and baby home, and run by the Bon Secours. It was a nun and religious order, and they were given there was 796 bodies found there, from fetuses to toddlers, some of them in septic tanks. They were literally killing these children. Women were having babies, the babies were taken and sold to America. But this was happening across the board, but the absolute worst of it was in Tuam. And I'll never forget when that broke in the country, when the news broke and the scale of it, there was just like a sort of national shock, something had really changed. There was just a real feeling in the air. And what's happened is this Fine Gael government that I spoke about that are trying to present themselves as lovely and liberal now, but that's because we pushed them there during the campaign, and I'll get to that in a second. But what they've done is there's a new maternity hospital opening up in Ireland next year and in the coming years, and the government have literally given ownership of the maternity hospital to a religious order. Now religious ethos, they won't perform abortions in in hospitals. They're still in 96% of our primary schools, although they are state funded, they're still there. That means that you don't get decent sex education, you don't get LGBT education, and that they will not be doing, even in hospitals, never mind gender reassignment surgeries, but vasectomies, whatever you say that word, but they won't be doing any of these procedures, and they still are in a huge amount of ownership in all our positions. So the next part of our campaign is to literally get them out of our institutions. So quickly, I will just talk about the campaign itself, right? So it was a massive movement, and this didn't just kind of happen overnight ourselves, because we're in a political party. And I would stress this, like, Ireland has seen fantastic change. We've had the marriage referendum, gay marriage referendum, we've had water charges. We're like the only country in Europe to push back against austerity successfully. And I've been involved in all of those, not just because I'm active, but because I'm in a political party that joins the dots and sees that each one is sort of the same part of the fabric, and that we need to roll back on that. So I'd always encourage people to get involved if you want to change the world, if you want to change your society, if you want to change your community, and if you want women's voices to be enshrined, that it's important, I think, to be a political party and join up all those fights and take it really to the next level. So the campaign itself, in 2012 we had the March for Choice, which was this annual thing, and there was 2,500 people at that. In 2017 it was 40,000, and this really happened again, but a very slow and continuous. We were always out in the streets with my political party, always out in the streets with our leaflets, getting people to sign petitions, just talking to people about it, doing stalls, different meetings around the world, around the country, and it just led eventually, a momentum increased. And we had these horrible stories breaking, and it just led to this fantastic movement of people power. But I think what was really a game changer in that, and we had Strike for Repeal, which was International Women's Day last year or 2 years ago. I can't remember which one we did this, the Strike for Repeal, but the tone had changed. Consistently we're like, free, safe, legal, these were our demands, we want them, and it was getting increasing, but the government were not listening. And as I said before, that we had to push them to even get this referendum, because traditionally they'd be quite right-wing. But even the slogans had changed. So instead of free, safe, legal, it was repeal the 8 and fuck the state. And people were angry, and women were angry, rightly so. And I'll never forget, Dublin was closed down twice in that one day, and it just coming up. I remember we came up for the second part of the protest, because we did local ones here. I'm in a city outside Dublin, and but just seeing a sea of black women, and they were black because it was all black and white is what we were wearing, and it was getting really dusky, and you could just feel the militancy. And after that, the government knew they had to change their tune, or they'd be gone. There was no lies about it. We would have stormed it all, like. And we had great fighters, like our own progressive left-wing TDs, Breed Smith, into it all, and she absolutely blew us out of the water in terms of fighting it in the Dáil and being a voice for the political movement, for the movement on the street, inside the political establishment, and that definitely helped us. But what was, I think, most important, and the thing I will always say to people, is that this was self-organised and this was grassroots, so it was from the bottom up. It was that constant drum of being on the stalls, of press statements, of women breaking that stigma and talking out of it, talking out of a world that had been shrouded in secrecy, because you used to get women coming up to in the stall and they'd whisper, I had an abortion. Like, they'd actually have to whisper it. You couldn't say that word on the street loudly. Like, that's the stigma that we were carrying. And none of us had really prior experience of that. Like, thousands of people came out in the streets and were canvassing all across the country, and we learned how to self-organise, because that's the potential and the capacity of the working class. And but something that I will always say is that when people ask you, like, even now, you still be buzzing about it, like, it is great crack when you think about it, that was unreal, like. But it was something had shifted, like, you know what I mean? I remember the next few days afterwards, like, things just felt and looked different, and I can't quite describe it, but I do really feel like technically, like, my town here, I remember sitting on the bed the next day kind of hungover, but that wasn't just a result of it, but like, everything just kind of had a different sheen. Like, it looked and it felt different, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it, like, but it was just a phenomenal feeling. And then ultimately what I think it was is, like, so much of our labour is used against us, isn't it? I did bar work for years, I hated it, and you had to go to work and you had to stand inside this little bar for 5, 6, 7 hours. You were told what you could wear. You could only go on your break and eat and go to the toilet when someone gave you permission. So much of our work, our labour, which is essential to our being, it's what makes the world go round, what makes us survive, you know, how we brush our hair and feed ourselves and all that. But that's used against us, isn't it? It's used in a very sort of controlling manner. And you know, even we all say it, like, roll on Friday, like, we can't wait for the weekend so that we can have some limited freedom. And what happened is, and this is where I put down the difference and how everything felt and looked different, is that technically the streets hadn't changed, but how I interact with the world had changed. My labour became my own. It became a part of the collective strength of thousands more of us, and that changed the country. That literally changed the country. So it was us not just taking a swipe and a massive dig at the Conservatives and everything that they've done to the women of this country, but it was us taking back control of our lives, our labour, and using that power and that potential to shift the world in a very fundamental and very different direction. And that was fascinating. Like, it was a great feeling, as I already said, and I can't quite describe it, but I can tell you want some of it. And as I'm always saying, get involved in a political party or in the campaigns in your area, and let's change the world that way, because it absolutely can be done. There's nothing holding us back. And so I just will say, and I'll finish up on this, I said I'd do 5 minutes, now I can see I'm on 15, so edit away if you have to. But what I can say was, it was watershed in that people's own stories helped break this stigma, talking about it in our home places, talking about it on the street. And there was I can't remember the name, for God, now that's terrible. In Her Shoes, that's what it was called. And this was a very popular Facebook page, and they did a booklet, and they just showed the reality of the 8th Amendment and what I was doing to women. The fact that it came from below, as I'd already said, was massively important. But what we're seeing now is that we have I think it's the same in Britain as well, massive housing crisis. And what is happening is that nearly everyone who was involved in Repeal the 8 is being pushed into this housing movement, because they've just gotten a taste of what is possible. And so we've got a very vibrant and radical housing movement, and that's actually why we're not there on Saturday, because we have our national demonstration against housing. So we've just seen a real politicisation, radicalisation of people, particularly young people, and with that lies so much potential. So I will finish there. I think it's important to recognise that the North of Ireland is not in the same position as well. It's still criminal up there, and they are actively prosecuting people. Now in Ireland we'd faced a 14-year jail sentence, but that was never really invoked. But in the North they are actively prosecuting people, and look into the stories there. It's scary stuff, it's very scary. And while we had our strike for repeal down here, that I mentioned, the radical movement, what they were doing is the police up in the north were actually breaking into activist homes and searching for abortion pills and all this. And for a long time, not only was Britain and the access to Britain being able to go over and have abortions there a sort of valve for this country, it was being able to smuggle pills in over the border as well up north. And so it's after we repealed the 8, thousands of us went up to the north and joined their rally there, and that's going to continue to happen. So it's fantastic to see. And I think all this as well has kind of came as a result, you know, I believe her, we had this horrible rape trial, and it's been happening again down in Cork, and one of the cities, there was a girl's knickers were used against her because they were a lacy tongue. You might have seen it, and it spurred the This Is Not Consent campaign. So we're seeing this massive revival of a women's movement, badly needed, and I think an awful lot of women will recognise that, and the men in our lives as well. So what I would say is, thanks for having me. I hope you found this video informative, and definitely think about getting involved with your local branch level, because we were part of a massive movement, but that didn't happen overnight. And I think it was very important where the areas where the left were meant that people had a sort of a group that were, like, I'd been in 3 different campaigns at this stage, of run elections and stuff, so we just had that little bit of a experience when it came to organisation, and that was very important. And a lot of people would say that here, even in the locality. So if you can be that base, so that when something like this does break or does happen, that we're able to help out, of course, with the community, and sort of develop our own skills and our own experience, and help others develop theirs, so that more and more people are able to take up the fights that are affecting our lives. So okay, I'll leave you on that. Thanks very much for having me, and have a great day.
I took the train. I live in Reading. Took the train with my children, went to London, as I do every Saturday, to stand in Trafalgar Square to protest and to raise awareness, really, about the uprising the popular uprising that is going on in Sudan at the moment against a very brutal regime, which I will talk about. So I met her, she was standing next to me, and we just sort of looked at each other and started talking, and before we knew it, we were discussing me coming here and speaking today. I'm incredibly proud also to be representing Sudanese British women, and I really mean it. I wear both citizenships. I'm a Sudanese citizen, I'm a British citizen, I was born in Sudan, but I lived the best part of 30 years here in the UK. I came back in 1991 to the UK, and I've been living here ever since. So without dwelling too much upon myself, what I really want to talk about, I want to celebrate the Sudanese woman. I really want to celebrate the Sudanese women's audacity, courage, determination, and I also want to celebrate Sudanese women's command of respect, both respect to themselves and respect from others for the work that they do. I also want to celebrate the leadership of Sudanese women. And I want to celebrate all of this in the context of the current uprising that is happening in Sudan. And I'll talk now a little bit about what is happening in Sudan. Sudan is being ruled, and to put it really bluntly, Sudan has been ruled for the last 30 years by a gang of criminals. And I mean a gang of criminals. People refer to them as the Sudanese government, and I absolutely refuse saying that they are Sudanese government, because what I understand from the word government, and I will really put my academic hat here and talk about the definition of government, which is a government sets and administers public policy, exercises executive, political, and sovereign power through customs, institutions, and laws. Now, Omar al-Bashir and his gang of criminals do not understand what government is, do not understand that their role is service to the country and the people of the country. Since they came into power, and the way they came into power is questionable, because we had a democratically elected government in 1986 that came on the back of a military dictatorship that ruled for 16 years. On the back of that, there was an uprising back in 1985, April 1985. Back then, I was a real activist. I was in my first year university doing a degree in civil engineering, and I was out in the streets protesting against Nimeri. And Nimeri turned out to be a very good dictator, actually, in comparison. So anyway, so we toppled Nimeri, there was a transitional government for a year, and then we elected. I, at the time, was 18, 19, and I went to the election booths, and I gave my voice, and we had an elected government that lasted for about, 1986 until 1889, so 3 years. Omar al-Bashir and his gang of criminals came on the night of the 30th of June 1989. So this June, they would have been in power for 30 years. So they came as a military government, toppling the democratically elected government, and actually going on a deliberate course of completely destroying the infrastructure in Sudan. And when I talk about infrastructure, I'm a civil engineer, but when I talk about the infrastructure, I don't mean it in an engineering way. I mean the health system has been completely destroyed. I mean the education system has been completely destroyed. Sudan, the production of oil that generated a revenue of billions of dollars, we do not know where the money went, because Omar al-Bashir and his criminal gang siphoned off billions of dollars relating to the revenue of from the oil into wherever, different parts of the world. The Sudan did not see a single penny. On the contrary, whatever small projects that they embarked upon, a road here and a bridge there, they actually borrowed money from other governments, from China, from Malaysia, from Turkey, to execute these projects, and now Sudan is under enormous debt. I've deviated away a little bit from, from my talk, excuse me, but actually, I just want to make the point that he's a criminal. 14 from him, the president, and 48 members of his ruling party are actually indicted by the International Criminal Courts. Why? For genocides that they have committed in South Sudan, now South Sudan. It used to be part of Sudan. Genocides and ethnic cleansing that they have committed in Darfur, for the rape of women in Darfur, for killing women and children in South Kordofan and in the Blue Nile. These are different regions in Sudan. And for this, of course, they are required by the International Criminal Court. But what they did in terms of destroying the society and the infrastructure is absolutely beyond belief. So coming back to celebrating women, under all of these atrocities, Sudanese women are actually, well, Jan said to me, I'm really quite surprised why there are so many Sudanese women participating in the protests. And she sees them on TV back home. Women are participating in huge numbers. And I said to her, they are not participating in these protests. Actually, women are leading the protests. Women are organizing events. Sudanese women are leading this uprising. Sudanese women are funding this uprising. And that is why I am here to celebrate the courage, the determination, the will, the intelligence of Sudanese women. Well, again, Jan was surprised, you know, Sudanese women, you think about a Sudanese woman, she's probably sitting at home somewhere cooking or whatever it is. But I think leadership and really high qualities run in our genes, and I will end up with this positive note. Thousands of years ago, and I'm going back to, let me just check my dates, 40 BC to 10 BC, we were ruled by a queen. Her name is Amaniris, and she was the queen of the ancient African Kush civilization back then. Sudanese queens were referred to as the Kandakas, great women leaders. And she was one of the most famous of these Kandakas because of her role leading the Kushite armies against the Romans in a war that actually lasted 5 years. She wasn't the only queen leader, and I mean it, political leader, economic leader. She was a leader back then. She wasn't the only one. Her daughter, her granddaughter, and her sisters were also queens of that Kushite civilization or kingdom, actually, in Sudan. So it does run in our genes, to be quite fair, and that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm celebrating the Sudanese woman under very difficult circumstances, and I just want to raise awareness and let you know about what's going on in Sudan, because unfortunately the Western media is turning a blind eye, but we are not going to be silenced, and we will topple Omar al-Bashir, and we will return the democratically elected government very soon, inshallah.
Our next speaker, we're really lucky to have, is Lynn Marie O'Hara. Lynn Marie is a Unison member from Glasgow, and people will have known about the absolutely fantastic struggle for equal pay in Glasgow. And so, without further ado, Lynn Marie.
inviting me here today to speak about equal pay in Glasgow. This has been going on for 12 years, and it's predominantly the women of Glasgow who deliver all the services that people forget about: your cleaners, your caterers, janitorial services, your learning support staff. It was the people that we always say are the invisible people that became incredibly visible on the day that they finally, after 12 years of struggle and opposition from a Labour council and then an SNP council, come in to say, we'll make it right. But everyone was just dilly-dallying around it thinking, these women will just shut up and go away. Well, we didn't shut up. What we did is we did some consultative ballots, we campaigned, and we started to believe in ourselves. And it is predominantly, this was a women's struggle. There are men that are going to benefit out of this because they do jobs that are predominantly done by women. But there were 8,000 women who finally had said, enough's enough. So what we did on the morning of Tuesday, 23rd of October, is we shut down Glasgow. We closed the whole of Glasgow. I, as a unison steward, would begin to think, can we do this? And then as we built up the campaign and we started to get this collaborative mentality of, yeah, we can do this, and we are going to do this, and please God they don't resolve it before we go and strike. Because I keep saying, the feeling in my heart was, it was like the circus was coming to town, there was this big event going to happen, you were part of it, we were the cause, we were going to be the ones that were going to benefit if people started to listen to our struggle. And you know, we've got members who would take 2 and 3 jobs, cleaning, catering, out the early hours of the morning, going to food banks. Now, see, as a city council, one of the biggest council in Scotland, could know that their employees are struggling, and all this nonsense about austerity. No, there's money there, just spend it wisely, spend it better, and represent the people that are delivering all of these services. So what we did is we said, right, okay, we all went on picket lines, we all had our t-shirts on, we had our stickers, we had all of this, and I've never been on strike. 32 years I've worked for the council, many things we could have gone on strike in and around, I've never been on strike. So on that morning I'm on a picket line thinking, what do I do? What is it I do now? But do you know what? We stood outside schools, we stood outside all the council buildings, and because of social media and people all texting and phoning each other, this momentum was building. So it was pouring the rain, the radio stations were there, the TV stations were there, and I'm thinking, this is magnificent. So what we then did is the school teachers who themselves have got their own dispute going on just now in Scotland, they were coming out and giving us tea and cake, and we thought, well, there's a party atmosphere going on. So then we all descended into Glasgow City Centre. I don't know if you know Glasgow, but it's got this, in the heart of it, it's called George Square, and it belongs to the people of Glasgow. So 8,000 of us marched through the streets from Glasgow Green, to People's Park, right up into the heart of the city. And there was like a festival, and it was women-led, and on the podium that day there was only women speakers, and I was one of them, and I could never imagine that I would have got up in front of anyone, let alone 8,000 people, to say, do you know what, we've had enough, pay us what we're due, pay us what we've earned, equal job, equal value, get it sorted and get it sorted now. And do you know what, there was a second day of strike. The picket lines were more full the next day, there was kids out their beds with their wee toot-toot signs for the cars to toot, homemade t-shirts. All of it. See that 2 days, do you know what happened thereafter? The council got back into the city chambers and they thought, oh my God, they're going to shut our city down again. So I'm glad to say that women have had this struggle and men are going to benefit, but we are now in a wonderful position to say our equal pay is getting settled and it's been agreed and we are going to get the pay out, and I hope it makes a change, and it is particularly women that it's going to change. And hopefully what I'm hearing from a lot of my members at UNIS is they're going to be able to give up 1 or 2 of their posts, or they're going to be able to make differences in their life for themselves and their families. And do you know what? See, the money that we get is we've earned every single penny, but the local economy is going to benefit. I was having a wee joke earlier. There's people, if I hear one more person's going to buy a sofa, I'm going to scream, right? Everybody's going to Florida, so Glasgow's going to get this pot of money, and it's costing about £588 million to put it right. But do you know what? Don't make it the women are greedy. That was 12 years we fought and struggled for this. So there's a very sense in that city, they'll listen, the 8,000 women could bring them down, and we did in 2 days of strike. And I'd just like to put a wee note in, some care workers down in Birmingham, and they've had 6 to 8 days of industrial action over an 18-month period, and I've got the privilege of meeting some recently at Bournemouth at the Women's Conference. And do you know what I said to them? See if you're not getting anywhere with your council, 8,000 angry Glaswegian women will be down in your door and we'll show you how to get your money. So thank you so much for inviting me here tonight, and do you know what, go sisters, go brothers. Thank you very much.
Right, our final speaker this evening is going to be Sally Campbell. Sally is the editor of Socialist Review magazine and also an author of A Rebel's Guide to Rosa Luxemburg.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to start with the question of equal pay, really, because today, the 6th of March, is Women's Pay Day. This is the day when women start getting paid for the rest of the year, having worked for 2 months effectively for free, when you take the average pay gap in the UK today. And when you consider how long ago the Equal Pay Act was passed, more than 40 years, 45 years, nearly 50 years now, it shows how far we have to go. And it also tells us something, I think, about how real change doesn't just come by passing a law in Parliament. It comes through the kind of action that people have been talking about tonight in Sudan, in Ireland, and up in Glasgow. I think we also know that, you know, there were some pictures that we showed at the beginning of the meeting which showed how many struggles have been taking place just over the past year involving women around the globe who have been struggling over all kinds of issues, whether abortion rights, whether it's over equal pay, you know, all the protests that have had to take place against the rise of the new right, you know, in its various forms, from Donald Trump, you know, at the head of the pyramid, through Bolsonaro, who just got elected in Brazil and immediately, you know, comes in with attacks on women, on gay people, on trans people, and all the rest of it, you know, and all of these people, their kind of misogyny, the homophobia, you know, the nasty backward social policies go hand in hand with the vicious racism that we've seen from these people as well. And I think, you know, what we've seen is millions of women starting to fight back in different ways. You know, we saw some of the biggest protests the world has ever seen against Trump in the women's marches, when something like 5 million people came out a couple of years ago after he was inaugurated. We will see this Friday possibly millions of women out on strike in the Spanish state, in Greece and elsewhere, taking up questions around harassment, around sexism that women face, and also about equal pay and lots of other things. And we've seen the Me Too movement continuing, haven't we? Something that exploded a couple of years ago, really, I think, boosted by the horror at Trump being elected president of the US, and which has continued to shine a light on the industrial scale harassment that many women face in work, but also, you know, more generally, and inside relationships and so on. As well. And retail has become a real focus for this, hasn't it? This week it was the head of Ted Baker who's had to stand down, who's got very similar kind of situation to Philip Green, the head of Topshop, who was already pushed out, you know, over these questions of how they treat their staff, the harassment, the kind of inappropriate behaviour, and so on. And all of this is taking place in the context of 10 years of austerity, or, you know, nearly 10 years since the economic crisis that has shifted the balance of where wealth goes in society, really. It's sucked more wealth up to the top and taken it away from people at the bottom. And women, of course, bear the brunt of cuts in services and changes in benefits that have been taking place. Something like 85% of the cost of cuts is paid by women, because women are the ones who play that role, the caring roles in society, the ones who tend to be responsible for those things. And I think this is really crucial. The question of the family and women's kind of perceived role in society, that their main role should be to do with, you know, having the children, raising them, looking after everyone, feeding people, caring for people. And I think that's what ties together all of those issues that we face in society today, whether it's the sexism, harassment, street harassment, catcalling, or it's the question of equal pay, or, you know, bodily autonomy, really, the kind of abortion rights and that kind of stuff. All of these things come back to that role that women are meant to play. You know, why do women get paid less? It's a combination of various factors, partly women working in part-time jobs, often because they have other responsibilities, and part-time jobs tend to be paid less, partly about the way that jobs that women tend to do are undervalued and not paid at the same level as jobs that men tend to do. You know, there's all of these factors add together, adding up to women's income over a lifetime is likely to be half of what a men's is. And the fact that austerity pushes all of that responsibility back onto individual women in the home. You know, every time some kind of service closes in your local area, it means more responsibility on women to take up those caring roles. And I think this does relate absolutely to why Me Too is necessary, because if the expectation is that women's primary goal at the end of the day is to be attractive enough to bag a man, have children, keep the man so that he can go out to work and, you know, help fund the household, because most households actually need 2 incomes anyway, you know, and if that expectation shapes all of our lives, whether or not we actually have children ourselves, I think that expectation is kind of society-wide, really, that women are meant to be nicer, meant to be more caring, meant to make other people feel better. It starts to explain the kind of sexism that women face in society. When you think, you know, if you're a woman and you walk down the street, I guarantee that at some point in your life, someone, normally a man, will have shouted, "Smile," at you, you know, ask you to smile, ask you to brighten the atmosphere and make them feel better and look prettier. The one I used to get a lot as a teenager in the grunge era was, "You're not making the best of yourself, love," which I wore as a badge of honour at the time, you know, that somehow I wasn't living up to this expectation to be nice, maybe wearing pastel colours or whatever it is. And we know that these things kind of tie in to the experience of work as well and harassment in the workplace. You know, a TUC study showed recently that the people who are most likely to experience workplace sexual harassment are young women and women who work in the worst paid kind of jobs on the worst kind of contracts. So often people who are working, you know, part-time or on temporary contracts and feel less confident to challenge the kind of behaviour that they experience. And often, you know, this will be jobs where they're working maybe in some kind of sector where they're having to deal with customers, like hospitality, like hotels, and so on, the food industry. But also, this tends to be in workplaces where there is a general atmosphere of bullying, you know, where the atmosphere is crappy in all respects, not just in terms of sexism in the workplace. And I think we also have to add into this that, of course, the main site of violence and abuse against women and girls is actually within the family, within relationships and between members of families within the home. You know, we know that 2 women still are killed every week by their partner or a former partner. And this is an issue that quite rightly has been highlighted, I think, quite a lot in the last couple of years, you know, with stuff like the Sally Challen case, that people might have heard about recently, where she's now got an appeal against her conviction for murder after having killed her husband after many years of coercive control in an abusive relationship. I think all of these things are being raised, and I think our job as socialists is to try and work out how they tie together and how we challenge that kind of society that we live in. Because for us, I think it has to be really clear that the root of women's oppression, which is very real, isn't biological. It's not because we're the weaker sex or we've got different brains or, you know, any of these kind of arguments that get put in society in general, or because women can have children. You know, women have always been able to have children, but I don't believe that women's oppression has always existed. You know, the idea that reproduction is just women's role is not something that has always been the case in societies. And I think we always have to remember that people have lived in lots of different ways. You know, this idea that men dominate in work, as we call it, and that women don't, you know, women are responsible for caring, is something that is really quite recent in terms of the whole of human history. And there are still societies today which maintain very different ways of living. You know, in southwest China, there's a society called the Mosuo people, who are a matrilineal society. Any property that exists is passed down through the female line because there is no monogamy, because women choose their partners freely, and there's no stigma to not knowing who the father of your child is. You know, there's not actually a word for father or husband in that language. The Aka people in Congo, women hunt, men cook. You know, cots don't exist because no one leaves babies unattended, and men suckle the babies with their own nipples when the women are busy working. You know, there's no kind of similarity in terms of how our society, the assumptions that we have in our society. I think we have this idea of the nuclear family as the ideal, you know, the father, the mother, the 3 children. Or actually, if you're in Viktor Orban's Hungary, more than 3 children, because he's currently offering tax breaks to any woman, any white Hungarian woman, of course, who has 4 children or more. She gets exemption from income tax for the rest of her life and a subsidised car. And I think that even those people who promote the family in that way, you know, or you think about the Tories in Britain who always want to push this idea of, you know, strengthening the family as a unit of society, they also destroy it, whether through the cuts that strain people, you know, to breaking point, or through the hostile environment to migrants, which splits families up, which deports people even though they've lived here for decades, which stops family members from coming into the country to join the rest of their family. And I think some people want to argue that we should be grateful that maybe it's a woman Prime Minister who's created the hostile environment, that maybe this is the answer, you know, is 50% of leaders and 50% of business leaders should be women. This is something that Christine Lagarde from the IMF thinks, you know, an institution which is responsible for imposing austerity and destroying people's lives around Europe and elsewhere. You know, she says banks would be more stable if there were more women on their boards, you know, presumably because economic crisis is down to testosterone or something. And I think that, you know, this kind of, you know, rich women's feminism is not something that can provide any kind of answer for us, really. You know, I don't think we should spend the day today celebrating Kendall Jenner's billionaire status, which she's self-made, apparently. You just have to be born into the right family. So they, you know, these people may well want equality, but they want equal opportunity exploitation, really. They want equality within the system that we have, which for the vast majority of people does not work on any level. More women at the top does nothing to change those things which I've talked about, which I think are at the root of women's oppression, this expectation on women in terms of their caring duties. Because even rich women who can afford to pay to alleviate most of that caring kind of burden, you know, who can pay for all the services that are required to take up the strain of a family, actually even they still think it's their responsibility to sort that out, if you see what I mean. It's still seen as women's role to be in charge of the caring. I think what would change it is a much more thoroughgoing change, and that's why I'm a socialist, really. And an International Women's Day comes from the socialist tradition. You know, this is not some random thing that just happens to be about women. It's something that comes out of actually a long history of women workers, and particularly garment workers, as it happens, taking strike action, taking the kind of collective action that we've heard about already tonight. You know, 8th of March, the date, comes from 1857, a garment worker strike in New York City. 50 odd years after that, garment workers again went on strike in New York and chose the date of the 8th of March to commemorate that earlier strike. 2 years after that, Clara Zetkin, a revolutionary socialist in Germany, you know, put out a call for the first International Working Women's Day celebration of strikes and protests on the 8th of March 1911. And that's when it first took place. And I think this thread has run through, you know, for all of the centuries since. In 1917, Russian women garment workers started the revolution on International Women's Day. And right up to today, really, where, you know, in the Egyptian revolution of 2011, textile workers, Mahala garment workers were central to toppling Mubarak. Where right now, you know, in Bangladesh, there are mass struggles of textile workers against the terrible conditions and against this new minimum wage that's been brought in by the government, which is £71 a month. You know, this is half of what people have been campaigning for, and thousands of garment workers have been sacked across Bangladesh just this year for protesting. Some of them, actually 100 of them, at the factory where a T-shirt went that recently went on sale saying "Girl Power" was produced. You know, so these are workers who are paid like 42p per hour who are being sacked for protesting. And I think in each of these mass collective struggles, the issue of respect is really central, and this is something we've heard about already, isn't it? You know, that we put so-called women's issues onto the public agenda to make them everybody's problem, to make them something that everybody has to deal with. You know, because none of these questions are really just women's issues, are they? Abortion rights, period poverty, domestic abuse, maternity leave, sexual harassment. None of these things are things that only affect women. You know, these are things that tell us something about the whole way that we live in our society today. And I think in order for women to be truly liberated, we need a society that's based on mutual respect. You know, in any humane, any rational society, actually it wouldn't just be women who are responsible for caring, it would be everybody. You know, this has to be the way that I think the kind of world that we want to live in. And I think respect is really central to that, because if you respect someone, then you don't catcall them, you don't harass them, you don't treat them as an object, you know, you don't think that their expectations about what they're able to achieve in life should be limited by their gender. And I think that capitalism cannot deliver that kind of society, because you can't genuinely have respect in a society that is based on exploitation, that is based on a minority of people exploiting the majority every single day. And I think we want a completely different kind of society that's based on cooperation and based on democracy. And I want to end on the words of a poem that has always been associated with another textile workers' strike, which is the one in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1912. And this is a really important part of America's forgotten history of radicalism, but a history that I think is being woken up again today with the teachers' strikes and all the stuff that's happening in the US at the moment. And I think it expresses something about how women's issues aren't women's issues. You know, women's issues are issues for all of us, and they have to be fought for by all of us. And it goes, our lives shall not be sweated from birth until life closes. Hearts starve as well as bodies. Give us bread, but give us roses.